Hello, I'm Bruce Baker, and this is another lecture in the History of New Orleans series. This lecture is about the built environment on the Antebellum New Orleans waterfront. So the main idea here, I'm very interested in the physical infrastructure of the waterfront in New Orleans. I think it's quite important to understanding the details of commerce in the city. So we have to look not just at the merchants and what they were importing and exporting, but it's very important, I believe, to consider how shipping worked, how handling of merchandise worked, and so forth. That allows us to understand how the actual labor of getting goods on and off of ships and moving them around the city and processing them and so forth shapes things. So I'm always very interested in this sort of material side of history, certainly in this sense, and sort of you might think of it as sort of the material side of business history in this case. So I think the main idea that I want to present here is that in the 19th century, as the quantity of trade increased in New Orleans on the waterfront along the Mississippi River, the infrastructure of the waterfront that was needed in order to handle this increasing volume of trade changed fairly constantly, and those changes had further effects on the rest of the city, because essentially it would be a bit of an oversimplification to say that New Orleans is its waterfront in the 19th century, but certainly without the trade coming and going at the waterfront, the city as we know it would not have developed in anything like the same way. So we'll start out with the period before steamboats arrive. And before steamboats arrive in 1812, trade came down the river. Goods from all over the Mississippi River Valley came down the river in a variety of flatboats. And in this image, I'll sort of move the cursor so we can see, these are the kinds of flatboats we're talking about. And they would have been built at the point of origin, or possibly quite near the point of origin, somewhere upstream on the Mississippi or one of its tributaries, and just sort of moved down the river, largely floated, sort of, this sweep is used to sort of move the boat through the water when the current itself isn't enough. And once these flatboats got to New Orleans, they were broken up and sold for lumber because it simply wasn't economical they weren't designed to go upstream. Some boats, called keel boats, like this, were designed to go upstream, and they were dragged back up the river. You can see the fella here standing on the boat, and he's got a line to the shore. So they would basically have one guy on the shore, or several guys on the shore, pulling the boat all the way back up the river. So you can sort of see why you made one trip to New Orleans a year. Now, in those early days, there was no particular organization to where boats landed, and boats of all different kinds moored in front of the French Quarter. So that's the area that I've got indicated by this white arrow here. A little bit later in this period, we start seeing the flatboats that are coming from upriver, sort of, remember this is upriver here, the flatboats coming and mooring along this stretch here, which is basically in front of Tchoupitoulas Street, which at that time was the nearest street to the river. Now, at this time, while trade is still relatively limited, and really we're only using certain portions of the waterfront, and it's not terribly organized, the levee itself is used for landing and selling of goods. So this is a sort of typical scene, I think from a bit later, but you sort of get the picture of boats just sort of haphazardly landed. You see goods sort of piled up here. They're not really stored anywhere. These might be offloaded, waiting to be sold somewhere. Trade actually happens on the levee, or they might be goods that are waiting to be loaded onto another boat. So it was very sort of haphazard. Goods are sort of piled up. The difficulty with this, of course, is that these goods are exposed to the elements. They're exposed to the wind and the rain. Unlike somewhere like London, which builds enclosed docks, so when we think of docks certainly in a British sense, We're talking about a body of water enclosed by quays where ships can come in and are really sort of protected from the harbor or the river, whatever they're coming in from. And those are all enclosed there. And with enclosed docks in London, later Liverpool, it's easier to sort of control the access, who has access to the waterfront. In New Orleans, as we know from reading Ari Kelman's book, A River in Its City, and other stuff, but especially that book, we know that the waterfront is open to the public. And so since the public can come and go, and you have people selling food there, you have all sorts of things happening, but it also means that the general public can come and buy goods straight off of these boats. And with no warehouses or public auction rooms at this time, if goods weren't already consigned to particular people, so if a boat arrives, whether this is coming from the sea or whether it's coming from upstream, if a boat arrives with goods, they may already have somebody's name on them. They may know who has bought them or is going to buy them and so forth. But if that's not the case, if they're not consigned to particular people, the ship captains had to hustle around the city and find buyers for the goods. You can really sort of see how inefficient this system is and how chaotic it is. But again, it works at a fairly small scale when there's not too much traffic. Eventually, there are regulations that allow goods to stay on the levee for no more than 1 week. So in other words, there are rules passed saying you can't just permanently pile your stuff on the levee because it is public space and everybody should be able to use it, and one individual or one business person or whatever isn't allowed to monopolize it by basically using it for permanent free storage. Now, one of the problems with this system is that, as I was saying, the goods are on the levee, so you don't have to pay for storage and things like that. However, the rain and the weather and so forth can damage them there. And with the sugar crop itself, not to mention other things, you see about $100,000 worth of damage to the sugar crop every year. But when the economy is buoyant, the traders just sort of absorb that loss and sort of move on to the next deal. So it's not a particular issue. Now, the river itself starts to have effects. So as we know, the river changes. And we see, starting around the beginning of the 19th century, Tchoupitoulas Street, remember, is originally the street nearest the river in Faubourg St. Mary. But the river is steadily creating batture in front of there from about 1800. And by the 1830s, you have to cross approximately 100 yards of mud to load and unload goods because the levee is now 100 yards of mud away from the actual edge of the river. This, along with these rules against leaving the goods sitting on the levee, they need to be hauled further and further. And also, as trade increases, you need more haulage of moving goods to different parts of the city. And by the 1830s, there are about 1,300 drays operating, drays being these sort of little wagons and carts used to move goods through the city. One of the things this does that is worth bearing in mind is it creates a lot of opportunities for small businessmen. So you basically just need a dray and something to haul it with, a horse, a mule, a couple of mules, whatever, and you've got a small business opportunity there. So it's interesting the way the changing nature of the shipping infrastructure on the waterfront sort of opens up and closes out different sorts of economic opportunities. And then, of course, that has knock-on social effects in terms of social structure and so forth. The other thing to mention about the increasing use of drays is that they work much better on paved streets than muddy streets. So it's really the streets in the Faubourg Saint-Marie that were the first ones to be paved, and the very first one is Gravier Street. Now, I want to think next about the organization of the waterfront after we get steamboats coming along. So the effects that the rise of steamboats after 1812 have is a steady decrease in the proportion of flatboats, and especially these keel boats that have to be dragged by hand up the river. Suddenly it makes a lot more sense to pay a bit of extra money to ship your goods on steamboat rather than waste the whole year practically, or half the year, sort of dragging a boat up the length of the Mississippi River and maybe up the Tennessee River and so on. The total amount and value of goods received in New Orleans increases really dramatically between the 1810s and 1840s. So this is not surprising as you get better transport options. And as a result, there's an increasing need to organize and formalize the use of the waterfront. So you can no longer have the sort of complete free-for-all that we had before, where boats just sort of tied up wherever was convenient to them and so forth, with no real guidelines. So December 1816, we see the first real sort of spatial organization of the waterfront. The city council passes an ordinance that governs how the waterfront is organized. And it's a very modest little ordinance, really, because it just says effectively that steamboats will be on the upper side of Canal Street down to the lower side of Custom House Street, which is now Iberville Street. So a very limited sort of area. We get further organization with an act of Congress in 1827, and this starts to further differentiate the use of the space. And Congress passes this because New Orleans is an official port of entry for the country. They have to collect federal customs duties and so on. So that gives, and also, of course, maritime matters are federal in jurisdiction. And so that gives Congress the entry point to actually start regulating stuff. And ships and other sea vessels anchor from Esplanade to Canal. So you can sort of see I've labeled this in green on the slide. So essentially what we're talking about there is ocean-going ships are docked in front of the French Quarter, and steamboats are docked, that is to say steamboats traveling up and down the Mississippi River are docking from Canal Street to Notre Dame Street, so essentially in front of Faubourg Saint-Marie, Notre Dame Street being sort of just over from Julia Street. The next big change is in 1836 when the Louisiana Supreme Court allows, sorry, that was the wrong slide. The Louisiana State Supreme Court allows the building of structures, including wharfs, on the riverfront. Now, this is a great slide that I found on Twitter some time ago. I think it's really handy if you're a bit of a waterfront geek. It sort of distinguishes what's the difference between a wharf, a quay, a jetty, and a pier. And we need to think about, are they built on piles, that is to say sort of big posts sunk down into the earth underneath the water, or are they built on fill, that is to say, is it solid sort of ground and rock and so forth. And the other thing is, are they parallel to the shore, or are they extending out perpendicular from the shore? So anyway, I just loved learning that terminology and thought you might as well. Now, the wharves that are built are somewhat impermanent, and this is because the Mississippi River, draining a very huge area, much of which has significant snow cover during the winter, the Mississippi River floods every spring, and this is back in the days before sort of modern flood control comes in. So cotton is shipped out from sort of late summer, maybe September, beginning of September or so, up through maybe early January. But the timing works out well because when the cotton season is finished, then you get the spring snow melt and the floods of the river, and you get the wharves just basically washing away. So every year the people would sort of strip down the outer wharves and the piers and just let the river wash things away and then repair and rebuild over the summer. And in this painting, you can sort of see these are sort of the outer wharves that we're talking about, and these are the piers, and then there would be other wharves sort of extending out directly from the levee back there. And that gives you a sense of how that worked. But every year, essentially, these outer wharves get washed away by the floods. The other thing to say before we wrap up here is to talk a little bit about the infrastructure for processing cotton. And the first thing I want, this is another look at wharves. This is actually quite a recent photograph that just sort of gives you a sense of how the wharves extending straight out from the levee sort of look, or a sort of modern version anyway. But the cotton processing infrastructure expands dramatically in these years between the 1810s and the 1840s or so as the quantity of cotton being grown and shipped increases. So in 1832, you get the Levy steam cotton press in Faubourg Marigny, and that's built at a cost of $500,000. In 1835, a second steam-driven cotton press, the Orleans Cotton Press, is built in Faubourg Saint-Marie at a cost of even greater, $750,000. These together have a combined capacity of 500,000 bales. Now, I suppose I didn't say what a cotton press does. What a cotton press does is it takes the bales that are coming in on the steamboat and it uses steam power to squish them down even tighter so that they have a sort of regular size and regular density and so forth, and they can be loaded into ships so that, you know, the people loading them, the screwmen, sort of know exactly how big it is, how many they can fit, make sure that the ship is balanced properly and so forth. There are also cotton pickeries, which I think most people don't know much about. I think they're quite interesting. They're a facility for dealing with damaged cotton or cotton that has been packed badly with, you know, maybe bits of damaged cotton in with the good cotton, or cotton of several different grades all jumbled up together and so forth. And what we see when New Orleans starts moving enough cotton through the city, there's enough badly packed or damaged bales. If a bale falls in the river or if it catches on fire or something like that, it needs to go to the cotton pickery. What happens here is you get individuals who are very, very poorly paid, sort of tearing the bales apart by hand, picking out the bits that are good, the different qualities, making big piles of it and so forth, sorting it out, then rebaling the good cotton and also the damaged cotton, because there was a market for that for other things, but rebaling all this and then recompressing it. And to be honest, I'm not entirely certain when they begin, and as far as I know, I don't know any other historians who are. If you do know more about this, please do get in touch with me. I'm very interested in it. But the first mentions that I can find in newspapers are in 1840 and 1841, which I think makes sense considering the increasing volume of the cotton trade in the 1830s as illustrated by those two steam cotton presses. So that's really all I wanted to say about the origins of and sort of development of the waterfront in New Orleans in the sort of period between the 1810s and the 1840s. I think it's also, as always, I want to sort of have a look at the bibliography. Much of this, of course, comes from R.E. Kelman. The other source for this very much is a great book from, I think, the 1940s by Harold Sinclair on the Port of New Orleans, and then there are the links for the images. And as always, if there are any copyright issues with images or whatever, please do get in touch and I will make amends and fix things. Thanks for listening and watching.